He didn't ask them to sleep with him. He built an academy and made them believe they were learning art. They were told to pose, to smile, to remove their robes. Not all were chosen, but they all tried. Hard. Some gave up their names, some gave up their pride, one gave up her life. The emperor? He called it beauty. History called it collapse. He called it an art academy. But the scent of perfume hit harder than the smell of ink. Emperor Huizong didn't build it to teach painting. He built it to select women. Officially, it was a place to cultivate aesthetic talent. In truth, it was a stage, and the only requirement was to be beautiful. Every year, hundreds of girls were escorted through its gates. They were told to study art. But what they really learned was how to stand still, how to smile without showing teeth, and how to take off their robes without breaking eye contact. No one asked why art training required soft skin, wide hips, and ivory shoulders. Inside the academy, lessons weren't about technique. They were about posture, about how to hold your breath, and how to look like you enjoyed being stared at. The instructors were court painters. The examiner was the emperor himself. They weren't trained to paint. They were trained to be painted. Inside the Imperial Academy, art was a performance, but not for critics, for one man. Each girl was taught how to tilt her neck, soften her gaze, lower her shoulders, how to look fragile, but available. They stood behind silk screens, barely covered, waiting for a signal. One nod from the emperor, and the screen would lift. The painters called it composition. The eunuchs called it inventory. Some girls were sketched once, some 100 times. They had no say. Their value rose with every session. The more they were drawn, the closer they got to the bedchamber. And everyone in the academy knew a painting was not the prize. It was the price. The girls weren't the artists. They were the tools. Each morning began with inspection. Hair neat, skin clear, no bruises. A flaw meant no drawing meant no rise. They were lined up in silk, eyes forward, breasts lifted, not to seduce, to be selected. The emperor sent painters to capture them. But he didn't want technique. He wanted obedience. If a girl flinched, she failed. If she cried, she was replaced. They were told the brush was sacred, that the artist was channeling beauty. But they knew. The brush moved where the emperor's eyes stopped. Some were asked to smile. Some were asked to kneel. Some were asked to undress slowly, as if modesty was a costume to be removed with grace. This wasn't education. It was choreography. It was never just about art. It was about ranking. Each session was scored, not with numbers, with glances, with how long the emperor looked, and how often he asked them back. Girls fought to be seen, to be painted again, to be moved, from canvas to chamber. Whispers filled the corridors. Who was sketched this morning? Who wore jade silk? Who smiled too easily? The reward wasn't gold, it was invitation, to a private sitting, to a private meal, to a private bed. Some girls fasted for days to keep their figure. Others used powder to fake sickness, so their rivals would be dismissed. The academy didn't need punishments. The girls punished each other. They all knew the truth. One night with the emperor could rewrite your life, or end it. The paintings were public. The nights were not. Every sketch session ended the same way, with names circled in red. Those girls didn't return to the dorms. They were taken quietly to a smaller room with a single silk mat and no ink. The emperor called it private review. The eunuchs called it the harvest. No lessons, no supervision, just him and her and what he thought beauty should obey. Some were asked to pose again, others were told to undress without being told. There was no contract, no exit. Once chosen, you were no longer a student. You were part of the collection. He would sometimes paint them afterward, but never their faces, only parts. A shoulder, a thigh, a gesture of surrender. The art was never on the wall. It was on the floor. It started with whispers. Then it became policy. Ministers began sending daughters to the academy, not to learn, to offer. A flattering sketch could mean a promotion, a private visit, a new title. Fathers instructed their girls on how to bow lower, how to speak softer, how to cry. Convincingly. They bribed the painters. They bribed the eunuchs. They bribed the emperor with flesh. What was once desire became currency. What was once shame became strategy. The court turned into a waiting room. Every minister hoping his gift would be favored. Every woman hoping her suffering would be rewarded. This wasn't seduction. It was brokerage. And the emperor? He didn't resist. He expanded the academy. He still held court, but only to review sketches. While the borders trembled and the people starved, Huizong curated his private museum. He cataloged smiles, labeled collarbones, ranked thighs by texture. The state budget shrank, but the canvas supply tripled. Advisors begged him to focus on war, famine, diplomacy. He answered with a painting of a girl bending over to reach a fallen flower. He believed beauty was order, that if the women were perfect, the empire would follow. He created a vault. Only he had the key. Inside, thousands of portraits, none framed, just rolled and stacked, flesh on paper, folded into silence. He stopped writing edicts. He wrote love poems instead, to women who had no voice. And in his silence, the empire began to rot. The ministers wore robes, but they were costumes. Every man in court played a part. Some praised the emperor's poems. Others recited fake critiques, just enough to appear honest. None dared speak truth. The emperor didn't need advice. He needed an audience. They watched his performances, his calligraphy, his paintings, his selections of girls, and they clapped. Because applause was safer than silence. Some officials brought in dancers, others gifted rare pigments with hidden meanings. Paint me loyal. Those who questioned his obsession disappeared. Those who flattered it got promoted. The empire became a stage, the emperor, its only star. And every disaster, every rebellion, flood, and famine was just off script. But no one shouted, "Cut." They were too busy bowing. She wore the crown, but she had no audience. The empress, once the symbol of virtue, now sat alone, surrounded by silk, but ignored. Her rivals? They came daily. Fresh faces, painted bodies, selected from the academy, delivered like offerings. The emperor didn't need a wife. He needed variety. He renamed the concubines by flower types: peony, orchid, plum blossom. Not for their scent, for their shelf life. The empress stopped speaking. No one listened. She was still in the palace, but her voice had been archived. Ministers bowed to her, but only because they had to. They knew the truth. If their daughters made the emperor smile, even the empress could be erased. What remained wasn't a harem. It was a rotation. And the throne beside him was just another empty seat. They used to marvel at his paintings. Now they looked away. The bodies on the scrolls were no longer graceful. They were limp, bent, exposed. Fingers twisted in fear, eyes staring at something off frame. He said he was experimenting with abstraction. But the eunuch saw bruises. He said he was exploring shadows. But the concubines flinched when touched. Paint dripped on silk. But some said it wasn't paint. Girls returned from private sittings, pale and shaking. Some disappeared altogether. No one asked questions. Not the officials, not the empress, not even the gods on the altar. Because in this palace, beauty was the excuse. And behind the excuse was a man no longer drawing. He was documenting. They thought the academy meant prestige. It meant trauma. Mothers waited at the gates, begging for news or for their daughters back. They were told to wait, then told to go home, then told nothing. Some never saw them again. Fathers didn't cry. They negotiated. They paid to get their daughters in. Then they paid to get them out. Then they paid to keep it quiet. Bribes became a second tax. Silence became a second religion. Merchants offered portraits as tribute. Governors sent poems with names hidden in ink. Even monks began delivering models, because pleasing the emperor meant funding for temples. The emperor never noticed. Or maybe he did. The girls weren't girls anymore. They were symbols of loyalty, of obedience, of what power could take and never return. New halls were built, not for soldiers, for sketching. While enemies marched toward the borders, Huizong opened another wing in the art academy. He called it the Pavilion of Female Forms. No one questioned the budget. They were too busy submitting daughters. Officials competed to design more aesthetic chambers, soft lighting, polished floors, hidden drains. Outside the palace, rice prices soared. Inside, silk shipments tripled. The people heard rumors that the emperor painted with peach juice, that his brushes were made from concubine hair, that he once spent 3 days perfecting a nipple's shadow while rebels stormed the northern forts. The empire didn't collapse in a battle. It collapsed in a gallery. And when the army called for reinforcements, the only reply was a poem. The barbarians crossed the Yellow River. Cities burned, walls fell. And Huizong? He was in his studio, painting orchids. His generals pleaded for action. He sent them scrolls, instructions on brush technique. He called it maintaining order through inner cultivation. The court called it madness. The people called it betrayal. Soldiers died barefoot. Artists got pay raises. The capital's defenses crumbled. But the emperor's garden was immaculate, newly decorated with girls posing as plum blossoms. Even as smoke clouded the horizon, he refused to evacuate. He said the academy was sacred, and when news arrived that the enemy had reached the palace gates, he ordered one last sitting. They stormed the palace expecting gold. They found paintings, thousands, scrolls filled with girls, naked, chained, some gagged, some crying, some smiling, but with empty eyes. The invaders didn't destroy the collection. They laughed and shared it. The enemy didn't need to humiliate the emperor. He had done it himself, in ink. When they dragged him through the streets, he begged not for his crown, but for his sketchbooks. He was no longer a ruler, just a man with fetishes, made public. The empire's collapse wasn't written in blood. It was drawn, one violated figure at a time. They didn't kill him. They displayed him. Huizong was paraded like a relic, not of royalty, but of ruin. His hands were bound, not because he might escape, but because they had once held the brush. He was placed in a cage. Visitors came to see the fallen artist. Children mocked his scrolls. Soldiers spat at his feet. The enemy showed mercy, but it wasn't mercy. They made him paint, for their wives, their mistresses, their amusement. No silk, just cheap paper. No muses, just orders. He signed each piece with trembling fingers. No longer son of heaven, just a man branded by his own obsession. He was no longer feared. He was studied, like a failed experiment, and every time he dipped the brush, he relived the empire he erased. The empire was dust, but the scrolls survived. Collectors fought over them. Scholars praised his technique. No one mentioned the girls. Brushstroke analysis replaced witness testimony. Art critics wrote essays. No one asked where the models went. His most infamous scroll, a girl tied in silk, smiling without reason, was hung in an aristocrat's gallery. It won awards. Generations forgot the crimes. They remembered the colors, the composition, the aesthetic innovation. His empire had collapsed, but his fantasies became canon. Beauty, once corrupted, became collectible. No one knew where his bones were buried, but his paintings hung in museums, cleaned, framed, celebrated. And every admirer who whispered genius also whispered silence over the girls who never came home. Some girls lived. They didn't speak. They became wives, or disappeared into temples, or vanished into the slums of new regimes. No one interviewed them. No historians came. Only silence. Their names weren't recorded. Their faces weren't painted. Their memories? Too shameful. Too inconvenient. The world preferred the emperor's scrolls, not the screams behind them. One woman tried to write her story. It was dismissed as fiction. Another burned every portrait she could find. She died alone. The survivors became myths, or ghosts, or warnings passed from mother to daughter. Never be too beautiful. Never be too talented. Never be chosen. They wrote books about his art, not his victims. They called him a visionary, a renaissance before the Renaissance, a man who saw beauty where others saw skin. Professors praised his balance of form and emotion. Critics obsessed over his brush control. Curators displayed his work next to saints. No one asked what happened to the models. They were irrelevant, disposable, aesthetic. The emperor's sins were archived in the art history section. He wasn't remembered for losing the empire. He was remembered for mastering perspective. The lesson was clear. If you want to be immortal, don't be good. Be gifted, and make your crimes beautiful. Centuries later, they restored the academy. Marble floors, fresh calligraphy, a bronze statue of Huizong at the gate. Tourists walked the halls. They marveled at the brushwork, the elegance, the silence. No plaques for the girls, no names etched in stone, no mention of why so many paintings had no signatures, just trembling hands frozen in ink. They called it cultural heritage. They called it national pride. They said, "Look what beauty we once had." No one said, "Look what it cost." He said he loved beauty. He meant he wanted to own it. The girls were told they were chosen, special, blessed. They were stripped, painted, forgotten. The court said it was art. The emperor said it was culture. But it was always the same ritual. Flatter them, frame them, use them. History will call him refined. His dynasty will be called enlightened. But in truth, it was a machine that turned girls into muses, muses into property, and property into silence. He built an empire on desire, and it burned from the inside out.